Hi, it's Pilar Kellenbarger with Collecting Our Angels, Nurturing Our Children. So, we're going to read the next three chapters of the BFG, The Big Friendly Giant. Don't forget, boys and girls, this is Mrs. K reading for you. And when you're listening to a story, try to picture everything in your thoughts. That is a really good strategy to comprehend and understand and remember the story details. So we're going to start with the cave. Last time we left off, he had just grabbed her and he's running towards the cave, and she's in the blanket getting bumped around. The giant ran on, but now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. The giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally. Although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant, he leaped over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a giant great forest, then down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around, and dead trees stood everywhere, like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side, the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out. He caused He paused to catch his breath. Suddenly, in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as it had been a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. He is getting ready to eat me, she told herself. He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. There's a picture of what she sees. She saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor, there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet, he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie crouched on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick steel rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. This is called the BFG chapter. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he really is going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone crunching giant. Bone crunching giant crunches up two whoopsie whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety crack for miles around." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone crunching giant only gobbles human beings from turkey," the giant said. "Every night, Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by his remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" Bone crunching giant says Turks is tasting oh ever so much juicier and more scrumptious. Bone cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey. I suppose they would, Sophie said. Of course they would, the giant shouted. Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumptious and some is ucky slush. Greeks is all full of icky slush. No giant is eating Greeks ever. Why not? Sophie asked. Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy, the giant said. I imagine that's possible too, Sophie said. She was wondering, with a bit of a tremble, what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having different flavors. Human beans from Panama is tasting very strong as hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundungle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human being. The human being is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable. Not the human being, the giant said. The human being has two legs and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There's something very fishy about whales. You mean whales? She's meaning like the mammal. Sophie said, Wales is something quite different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys, Sophie said. You are once again gobble funking, the, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs. The giant went on. Of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark are tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste like? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best. And I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Here he is talking to Sophie. Wellington, Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squishy flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumptious taste, so says the welly eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around anymore. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me? Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night. But not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. The next one we're going to read is The Giants. But if you are so nice and friendly, Sophie said, then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me? Because you saw me, the big friendly giant answered. If anyone has ever seen a giant, he or she must be taken away hipswitch. Why? Asked Sophie. Well, first of all, said the BFG, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist. I do, Sophie said. Here's my kitty. Ah, but that is only because you have seen me, cried the BFG. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing, you would be scuttling around, yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant. And then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see, would be starting up all over the world. And with the human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited, people would be coming rushing and bushing after me with goodness knows what. And they would be catching me and locking me into a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into the zoo or the Buncombe house with all those squiggly hippodumplings and crocodile dillies. Sophie knew that what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually seeing a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would be more certain there would most certain certainly be a terrific hullabaloo across the world. I bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have splashed the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away? I suppose I would, Sophie said, and that would never do, said the BFG. So what will happen to me now? Sophie asked. If you do go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG. Most likely all the telly bumpkin box and the radio squeaker. Do you so you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life. Oh no, cried Sophie. Oh yes, said the BFG. But I am warning you not ever to go whiffling about out of the cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an ucky mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching even one tiny little glimpse of you. The big friendly giant picked Sophie off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, "Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you is seeing." Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was up now and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees. "Is you seeing them?" the BFG asked. Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving among the rocks. Here's a sketch of that. So she's peeking out, and this is what she sees. About 500 yards away, three or four others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. "This is giant country," the BFG said. "Those is all giants, every one. It is a brain-boogling sight." The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were. Many of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly. And perhaps that is a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" Sophie asked. "Nothing," said the BFG. "They is just moo chilling and foot chilling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers." "You mean to Turkey?" Sophie said. "Bone crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey, of course," said the BFG. "But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flung away places like Wellington for the booty flavor and Panama for the hatty taste. Every giant is having his own favorite hunting ground." "Do they ever go to England?" Sophie asked. "Often," said the BFG. "They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of cod scallop." That's not, I'm not sure I quite know what that means," Sophie said, meaning "Meanings is not important," said the BFG. "I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I is left instead of right. And are all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people?" Sophie asked. "All of them is guzzling human beings every night," the BFG answered. "All of them except me. That is why you will be coming to an ucky mucky end if any of them should ever be getting his gogglers upon you. He would be You would be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie all in one dollop." "But eating people is horrible," Sophie cried. "It's frightful. Why doesn't someone stop them?" "And who, please, is going to be stopping them?" asked the BFG. "Couldn't you?" said Sophie. "Never in a pig's whistle," cried the BFG. "All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They is all at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness." "Twice as high as you," cried Sophie. "Easily that," said the BFG. "You is seeing them in the distance, but just wait till you get them up close. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall, with huge muscles and cockles alive. Oh, I is the titchy one. I is the runt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country. You mustn't feel bad about it, Sophie said. I think you are just great. When when even your toes must be as big as sausages. Bigger, said the BFG, looking pleased. They is as big as bumple hammers. How many giants are there out there? Sophie asked. 9 altogether, answered the BFG. That means, said Sophie, that somewhere in the world every single night 9 wretched people are carried away and eaten alive. More, said the BFG. It is all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before he is feeling full. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, is ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck-in. But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? Sophie asked. All countries excepting Greece is getting visited sometime or another, the BFG answered. The country which a giant visits is depending on how he is feeling. If it is a very warm weather, a giant is feeling as hot as a sizzle pan. He will probably go galloping far up to the Frisbee North to get himself an Eskimo or two to cool down. A nice fat Eskimo to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'd take your word for it, Sophie said. And then again, it is if it is a frosty night and the giant is fridging with cold, he will probably point his nose towards the sweltering hotlands to guzzle a few Hottentots to warm him up. How perfectly horrible, Sophie said. Nothing hots Nothing hots a cold giant up like a hot Hottentot, the BFG said. And if you were to put me down on the ground and I was to walk out among them now, Sophie said, would they really eat me up like a wiffles whittle? Cried the BFG. And what is more, you is so small they wouldn't even have to chew you. The first thing to be seen, you would pick you up in his fingers, and down you'd go like a drop of drain water. Let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them. Oh my gosh, those were really great chapters. So don't forget to go online and look for some sheets to color maybe while I read. Maybe do some vocabulary words to understand what some of the words are that he says. And don't forget to come back and we'll go to the next 3. Have a good one.